Miriam is professor of Greek literature and its reception at University College London. Her research interests lie especially in Greek literature and philosophy, and in their reception, and in the history of modern European thought. Her work explores the intellectual history of classics in modern European thought from the 18th century to the present, and examines how an engagement with the classical past has given rise to a particular understanding of modernity. Her books include the wonderful Athens in Paris, Ancient Greece and the Political in Post-War French Thought, Derrida and Antiquity, Socrates and the Jews, Hellenism and Hebraism from Moses Mendelssohn to Sigmund Freud, and a forthcoming book, Tragic Modernities, that will be published by Harvard University Press.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you so much to Emma, Sarah, and Brooke for the invitation to be part of this wonderful conference, which I have been thinking about for several years, so it's great to be here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about tragedy, so we're moving on from Plato to Greek tragedy, and think a little bit about questions of the human and humanism in particular in relation to the questions of the conference. Okay, so in his introductory lectures to psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud talks about the three so-called narcissistic wounds which have been inflicted on humanity. The first blow to what Freud calls the naive self-love of man was orchestrated by Copernicus, who made us realize that our Earth was not the center of the universe, but only a tiny fragment of a cosmic system of scarcely imaginable vastness. The second blow came with Darwin, who destroyed man's supposedly privileged place in creation. The third, and what Freud calls the most wounding blow, was dealt by Freud himself, who revealed how the ego is not a master in his own home. These three narcissistic wounds, these three moments in the re-evaluation of the human, together constitute the experience of modernity. They are the abyss, it seems, which separates us from ancient times, the ruptures in the fabric of humanity, which call into question the very concept of a transhistorical human nature, and thus in the process make the ancients feel irredeemably alien to us. But for all the stress he places on this succession of revelations, Freud's account in the introductory lectures is not predicated on a chasm between antiquity and modernity. Speaking of the cosmological blow, Freud claims this is associated in our minds, I'm quoting, with the name of Copernicus, so something similar had already been asserted by Alexandrian science. In a later reworking of this passage, Freud pushes the discovery back still further to the Pythagoreans and declares, and I quote, even the great discovery of Copernicus, therefore, had already been made before him. Freud folds the pre-existence of cosmological theories in antiquity back into his general thesis about the vulnerability of mankind's self-love. Even Copernicus was not a master in his own home, just as modernity is not capable of keeping out the intrusion of antiquity. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Beyond the evident irony of Freud's statements about the demise of narcissism being expressed in a passage brimming with his own narcissism, what interests me is the way in which Freud shines a spotlight on the abilities of ideas from the ancient world to unsettle an account of the human. Psychoanalysis as the site of a certain post-humanism thus finds its source for a critique in antiquity. In this way, Freud, to a certain extent, anticipates Kerry Wolfe, who specifies how his posthumanism, I quote, is analogous to Jean-François Lyotard's paradoxical rendering of postmodern, in that it comes both before and after humanism. Despite what Derrida says in L'animal que donc je suis about the persistent anthropocentrism, even Cartesianism of psychoanalysis, Freud can lay some claim to ushering in the posthuman. It's not just that his emphasis on sexuality presents man in his naked animality, but that by foregrounding the unconscious, he threatened the site of human exceptionalism. In overthrowing the primacy of reason, Freud laid the ground for a different conception of life. Nowhere is this more evident than in the discussion of the life and death instincts in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and this is number 1 on your handout. There he writes, The instincts which watch over the destinies of these elementary organisms that survive the whole individual, which provide them with a safe shelter while they're defenseless against the stimuli of the external world, which bring this about their meeting with other germ cells and so on, these constitute the sexual instincts. They are conservative in the same sense as the other instincts, in that they bring back earlier states of living substance, but they are conservative to a higher degree in that they're particularly resistant to external influence, and they're conservative too in another sense in that they preserve life itself for a comparatively long period. They are the true life instincts. They operate against the purpose of the other instincts, which lead by reason of their function to death. So Freud's fundamental insights into the dynamics of existence is no philosophical exposition on human finitude, but rather the exploration of the instincts of a germ cell. In choosing the germ cell as the object of analysis, Freud decidedly threatens the priority of human life. Indeed, by analogizing the experience of human and primitive cellular life, Freud draws attention to what Jane Bennett has called the vital materiality of existence, and this is expressed in handout number 2. She writes, "Vital materiality better captures an alien quality of our flesh, and in so doing reminds humans of the very radical character of the fractious kinship between the human and the non-human. My own body is material, and yet this vital materiality is not fully or exclusively human. My flesh is populated and constituted by different swarms of foreigners. The crook of my elbow, for example, is a special ecosystem, a bountiful home to no fewer than 6 tribes of bacteria. The its outnumber the me's. In a world of vibrant matter, it's not enough to say that we are embodied. We are rather an array of bodies, many different kinds of them, in a nested set of microbiomes." Nevertheless, within several pages, Freud's microbiome that he describes in the previous passages has ceded its place to a different account of vitality, and this is handout number 3. He writes, "The germ cells themselves would behave in a completely narcissistic fashion, to use a phrase that we're accustomed to use in neuroses to describe a whole individual who retains his libido in his ego and pays none of it out in object cathexes. The germ cells require their libido, the activity of their life instincts for themselves, as a reserve against their later constructive activity. In this way, the libido of our sexual instincts would coincide with the eros of the poets and the philosophers, which holds all living things together." So changing the focus to the whole individual, Freud ascribes narcissism to his cells. Given the overtly anthropomorphic mediation that Freud performs, it is not difficult to see why Derrida was skeptical about the possibility of psychoanalysis being open to the response of the animal. As Derrida phrases it, there is no desire, and thus no unconscious, except for the human. In his reference to poets, to philosophers, and to eros, Freud further transfers the discussion to a human, if not to say humanist, plane. The instincts of biological organisms give way to the poetic vocabulary of eros. As Freud would write elsewhere of his adoption of the language of eros, he writes, "Anyone who considers sex as something mortifying and humiliating to human nature is at liberty to make use of the more genteel expressions eros and erotic. I might have done so myself from the first, and thus spared myself much opposition." Freud's genteel Greek would seem to stand as the last defense of the naive self-love of man. But there is more at stake in the classical reference than a concession to gentility. Freud's classical vocabulary gestures towards a longer intellectual history, for despite Freud's denial of influence, critics have detected a precursor to his life and death drives in another figure who would create his own posthuman antiquity, and this is number 4 in your handout. Their 2 deities of art, Apollo and Dionysus, provide the starting point for our recognition that there exists in the world of the Greeks an enormous opposition, both in origin and goals, between the apolline image maker or sculpture and the imageless art of music, which is that of Dionysus. These 2 very different drives, he uses the word Triebe, exist side by side, mostly in open conflict, stimulating and provoking one another to give birth to ever new, more vigorous offspring, in whom they perpetuate the conflict inherent in the opposition between them, an opposition only apparently bridged by the common term art, until eventually, by a metaphysical miracle of the Hellenic wheel, they appear paired, and in this pairing, finally engender a work of art which is Dionysiac and Apolline in equal measure. Attic tragedy. In designating the Apollinian and the Dionysian as Triebe, drives, Nietzsche lays the groundwork for beyond the pleasure principle. The resonance is perhaps at its strongest in his description of Apollo, which is on handout number 5. He writes, thus in an eccentric sense, one could apply to Apollo what Schopenhauer says about human beings trapped in the veil of Maya. He writes, just as the boatsman sits in his small boat, trusting his frail craft in a stormy sea that is boundless in every direction, rising and falling with the howling mountainous waves, so in the midst of a world full of suffering and misery, the individual man calmly sits, supported by and trusting the principium individuationis. Indeed, one could say that Apollo is the most sublime expression of the imperturbable trust in this principle and of the calm sitting there of the person trapped within it. One might even describe Apollo as the magnificent divine image of the principium individuationis, which whose gestures and gaze speak to us of all the intense pleasure, wisdom, and beauty of semblance. So the image of Apollo calmly navigating the seas and preserving the individual from the onslaughts of the external world has a strong echo in Freud's discussion of elementary organisms. In Freud's hands, the principium individuationis, which Nietzsche identified with Apollo, becomes the pleasure principle. It is the life instinct which preserves the individual by providing a safe shelter from the onslaughts of an outside world. But these life instincts also conserve the individual against its internal destruction through death. Nietzsche's Olympian duel between Apollo and Dionysus is transformed by Freud into a contest between Eros and Thanatos. And this is number 6 on your handouts. Freud writes, our speculations have suggested that Eros operates from the beginning of life and appears as a life instinct in opposition to the death instinct, which was brought into being by the coming to life of inorganic substance. These speculations seek to solve the riddle of life by supposing that these two instincts were struggling with each other from the very first. In this conflict between different drives, Triebe in Freud and Nietzsche's terms, Freud envisions a bounded self in conflict not only with an external world, but also with itself. And this is handout number 7. If we are to take it as a truth that knows no exception, that everything dies for internal reasons, becomes inorganic once again, then we shall be compelled to say that the aim of all life is death. While Nietzsche populates his essays with Greeks, Nietzsche's text teems with primitive organisms. While Nietzsche populates his essay with Greeks, Freud's text teems with primitive organisms. And yet Freud would soon give a social context to the discussion of the death drive. In Civilization and its Discontents, Freud projects the struggle between Eros and Thanatos onto the screen of culture. Its core thesis about the origins of civilization in the sublimation of aggression restages at the societal level the conflict we previously witnessed at the microbiological level. Art, literature, music, even political organization emerge as the byproducts of the clash between Eros and Thanatos. If art is the term which bridges the conflict between Nietzsche's Apollo and Dionysus, civilization is the remainder of the struggle between Freud's life and death instincts. But there is one cultural byproduct which retains a special place in his narrative, and this is number 8 on your handout. The analogy between the process of civilization and the path of the individual development may be extended in an important respect. The superego of an epoch of civilization has an origin similar to that of an individual. It is based on the impression left behind by personalities of great leaders, men of overwhelming force of mind, or men in whom one of the human impulsions has found its strongest and purest, and therefore often its most one-sided expression. In many instances, the analogy goes still further, in that during their lifetime, these figures were often, even if not always, mocked and maltreated by others, even dispatched in cruel fashion. In the same way, indeed, that the primal father did not attain divinity until long after he had met his death by violence. The most arresting example of this fateful conjunction is to be seen in the figure of Jesus Christ, if indeed that figure is not part of mythology, which called it into being from an obscure memory of that primal event. So tragedy is the art form which best expresses the epoch's superego. In the constant va-et-vient of destructive aggression and instinctual renunciation, civilizations restage the drama of the primal horde. Although it is Jesus Christ who is named here, we know from Totem and Taboo that it is Oedipus who stands behind the mythology of the primal event. The great leader and his inevitable fall models the dynamics of civilization. Oedipus is the figure in whom Eros and Thanatos conjoin in the most dramatic fashion. But while civilization in its discontents tracks the tragic dynamic of culture modeled on Oedipus, it is Freud's self-appointed successor, Jacques Lacan, who will seal the relationship between Oedipus and the death drive. For Lacan, it is Oedipus's fate which illustrates how, I quote, the human being himself is in part outside life. He partakes of the death instinct. While Freud had focused in his discussion of Oedipus on Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus, Lacan argues that Oedipus's analysis is only completed at Colonus. In his return to Freud, Lacan reminds us, I quote, don't forget that Oedipus's unconscious is in fact that fundamental discourse which accounts for the fact that Oedipus's history has for a long time, forever, been written, accounts for the fact that we know it, and for the fact that Oedipus is totally ignorant of it, despite having been its plaything from the start. Oedipus's unconscious forms the central plank of Freud's decentering of the human subject. By showing how the ego is not master in his own home, Freud reveals the fragility of individual consciousness and upends the Enlightenment vision of Oedipus. As Shoshana Fellman has shown, Freud's Oedipus demonstrates to Lacan that, I quote, the unconscious is the discourse of the other. First, he goes on to argue, that's Lacan, the unconscious is the subject unknown to the self, misapprehended, misrecognized by the ego. Lacan, however, reveals the centrality of death to Oedipus's unconscious. And this is number 9 on your handout. He writes, when we come to talk of death again, I will perhaps try and explain to you the end of Oedipus's tragedy as the great dramatists have portrayed it. You should read Oedipus at Colonus. There you will discover that the final world of the relation, of man to this discourse of which he is ignorant is death. Lacan turns to a particular passage in Sophocles' play to elucidate his declaration, and this is number 10 on your handout. He writes, in Oedipus at Colonus, Oedipus says the following, am I made man in the moment when I cease to be? That is the end of psychoanalysis. The psychoanalysis of Oedipus is only completed at Colonus when he tears his face apart. This is the essential moment which gives the story its meaning. Oedipus's question to Ismene, more literally, when I no longer exist, then am I a man, unlocks the drama for Lacan. In locating his identity as a man in the moment of his death, Oedipus reveals the identity of the subject in his own negation. Oedipus becomes, in Lacan's terms, the subject beyond a subject. The story of Oedipus's death at Colonus is exemplary for Lacan because it illustrates the entry of Oedipus into collective discourse through his death. This is the longer passage from the Oedipus at Colonus on which Lacan draws in its handout number 11. Oedipus says, what, had you come to hope that the gods would ever have concern enough for me to give me rescue? Ismene says, yes, that is my hope, father, from the present oracles. What are they? Oedipus says, what has been prophesied, my child? That you'll soon be desired someday in life and death by the men of that land for their safety's sake. And who could profit from such a one as I? Their power, it is said, proves to be in your hands. And then here, the crucial line, when I no longer exist, then I am a man. Yes, for the gods now raise you up, but before they worked your ruin. So Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus recounts Oedipus's transition from transgressive individual and social pariah to symbol of collective safety. This transition crucially takes place at the moment of his death. By narrating Oedipus's metamorphosis from man to myth, Sophocles also narrates Oedipus's entry into language. Lacan's aim in turning to Oedipus is to understand the relationship of the ego to discourse. The ego, he argues, and this is number 12, is caught in a chain of symbols. It is an element indispensable to the insertion of the symbolic reality into the reality of the subject. It is tied to the primitive gap of the subject. On account of that, in its original sense, within the psychological life of the human subject, it is what appears as closest to, as most intimate with, as on closest terms with death. For Lacan, the ego is close to death because it exists as a nodal point between the common discourse in which the subject finds himself caught, alienated, and in his psychological reality. Lacan describes the splitting of the self, which occurs when one learns to use another's language. The entry into language is experienced by the subject as a form of death. Oedipus's death is thus crucial to the understanding the nature of his fractured identity. Within this context, it is notable that the famous description of the fort d'art game, which sets the scene for the pleasure, beyond the pleasure principle, is analogized by Freud to the creation of tragedy. So this is the discussion of his grandson playing. He writes, and this is number 13, finally a reminder may be added that the artistic play and artistic imitation carried out by adults, which unlike children's are aimed at an audience, do not spare the spectators. For instance, in tragedy, the most painful experiences can yet be felt by them as highly enjoyable. This is convincing proof that under the dominance of the pleasure principle, there are ways and means enough of making what is in itself unpleasurable into a subject to be recollected and worked over in the mind. The consideration of these cases and situations which have a yield of pleasure as their final outcome should be undertaken by some system of aesthetics with an economic approach to its subject matter. They are of no use for our purposes, since they presuppose the existence and dominance of the pleasure principle. They give no evidence of the operation of tendencies beyond the pleasure principle, that is, of tendencies more primitive than it and independent of it. So the motive for play that Freud identifies in his young grandson is paralleled by the urge for artistic imitation, which persists into adulthood. Tragic poetry would in this sense be a form of repetition compulsion, which allowed the spectators to recuperate the unpleasurable content of the play in the act of pleasurable spectatorship. Tragedy on this analysis has nothing to do with the death drive, because the painful experiences that the spectators witnessed are filtered through an Apollinian veil of aesthetic enjoyment. But as Lacan argues, the significance of the beyond the pleasure principle is that this isn't enough, and this is what he writes, handout number 14, following from that quotation about it not being enough. What Freud's primary masochism teaches us is that when life has been dispossessed of its speech, its final word can only be the final malediction expressed at the end of Oedipus at Colonus. Life doesn't want to be healed. The negative therapeutic reaction is fundamental to it. Anyway, what is healing? The realization of the subject through a speech which comes from elsewhere. This life we're captive of, this essentially alienated life, existing, this life in the other, is as such joined to death. It always returns to death. So in turning to Oedipus at Colonus, Lacan questions Freud's understanding of tragedy. Analyzing Oedipus through his end at Colonus reveals how tragedy cannot be contained by the pleasure principle. The real outcome of tragedy is not the life, but the death instinct. As Shoshana Feldman phrases it, and this is number 15 on your handout, beyond the pleasure principle stands to the interpretation of dreams, the work in which Freud narrates for the first time his discovery of the significance of Oedipus the king, in precisely the same relation in which Oedipus at Colonus stands to Oedipus the king. In his recalibration of Freud, Lacan replaces the Oedipus of Eros with the Oedipus of Thanatos. So, in the ethics of psychoanalysis, Lacan again puts Greek tragedy at the center of its investigation of humanism. For too long, it argues, we found in Greek tragedy's conflicts a reaffirmation of the human condition. Lacan, by contrast, wants to illustrate Sophocles to his decidedly anti-humanist project. We've already seen this with Oedipus at Colonus, and he comes back to it in the Antigone. He writes, some people have said that Sophocles is a humanist. This is number 16 on your handouts. He is found to be human since he gives the idea of a properly human measure between a rootedness in archaic ideals represented by Aeschylus and a move towards bathos, sentimentality, criticism, and sophistry that Aristotle had already reproached Euripides with. I don't disagree with the notion that Sophocles is in that medium position, but as far as finding in him some relationship to humanism is concerned, that would be to give a wholly new meaning to the word. As for us, we consider ourselves to be at the end of the vein of humanist thought. But in aligning the divided subject of psychoanalysis to the death drive, does Lacan not run the risk of resurrecting a different kind of humanism? Within contemporary theory, tragedy has repeatedly been invoked in the formulation of what Bonnie Honig has called a mortalist humanism, and this is number 17 on your handout. Humanism, Honig writes, has in recent years been making a comeback. not the rationalist, universalist variety discredited by post-structuralism and the horrific events of the 20th century, but a newer variant. This humanism asserts that what is in common to humans is not rationality, but the ontological fact of mortality, not the capacity to reason, but the vulnerability to suffering. Should one understand Lacan, then, as a mortalist humanist, given his interest in the death instinct? Defined by a finitude and not by our desires, by thanatos and not eros, Lacan can be seen to advocate a rather conventional account of common humanity. But he will insist otherwise, and this is 18 on your handout. This again is from the Oedipus at Colonus seminar. That is what life is, a dogged detour in itself transitory and precarious and deprived of any significance. Why, in that of its manifestations called man, does something happen which insists throughout this life, which is called meaning? We call it human, but are we so sure? Is this meaning as human as all that? A meaning is an order, that is to say, a sudden emergence. A meaning is an order which suddenly emerges. A life insists on entering into it, but it expresses something which is perhaps completely beyond this life. Since we get to the root of this life, behind the drama of the passage into existence, we find nothing beyond life conjoined to death. So the precarious life that Lacan describes is a life without significance. It is not a life given meaning by virtue of its precarity, but a life whose potential for meaning is negated by its telos in death. The drama of the passage into existence is completely overshadowed by the tragedy of death. Moreover, where mortalist humanism emphasizes commonality as an essential component of human loss, the relationship of Lacan's divided self to a community is much more circumspect. Nevertheless, both Judith Butler, in the book that gives its title to my talk, and Lacan predicate their precarious lives on a life lived in common with others. For Lacan, as we saw, it is a subject's entry into collective language which constitutes both her identity as a subject and her orientation towards death. Butler's human vulnerability is a recognition of the necessity of intersubjectivity, and this is number 19 on your handout. She writes, "There is a more general conception of the human with which I'm trying to work here, one in which we are from the start, even prior to individuation itself and by virtue of bodily requirements, given over to some set of primary others. This conception means that we are vulnerable to those we are too young to know and to judge, and hence vulnerable to violence, but also vulnerable to another range of touch, a range that includes the eradication of our being at one end and the physical support of our lives at the other." Where Lacan emphasizes discourse as the site of primordial interdependence, Butler pays attention to the bodily needs which open us to others. Ronnie Honig has criticized Butler for failing to recognize a third possibility for human commonality between her poles of eradication and support. Drawing on Hannah Arendt's concept of natality, she posits action in concert as an alternative to the violence of sovereignty that both Lacan and Butler reject for different reasons. Action, Honig argues, which expresses what Arendt calls the ontological fact of natality, is a non-sovereign performance that works to reconstitute communities and inaugurates new realities. Arendtian action exposes us to mortality. We may die in action, after all, but it is not about grievability. So by failing to recognize action, Butler, just like Lacan, subsumes what Lacan calls the drama of the passage into existence to the tragedy of mourning. Yet if both Lacan and Butler emphasize a life which does not want to heal, Lacan nevertheless acknowledges some agency, one might even say action in concert, involved in living such a life. You remember he says, "Anyway, what is healing? The realization of the subject through a speech which comes from elsewhere." So tragedy, I want to argue, is this speech which comes from elsewhere. In his essay, "And Say the Animal Responded," Derrida takes Lacan to task for his failure to listen to a voice which comes from elsewhere, in this case, the voice of the animal. For all his desire to subvert the subject, Derrida exposes Lacan's deafness to the language of what he calls the ahuman. Language may come from the other, but this other, for Lacan, is always an other understood from the perspective of the human. Although Lacan thinks it is language as such which calls the human being into question, Derrida will argue that it is his very emphasis on speech and language which is the site of Lacan's anthropocentrism. So this should take us back to some of the ideas we were talking about this morning. He sees this dynamic played out in a quotation from Lacan's The Direction of Treatment, which is number 20 on your handout. So Lacan says, "It must be posited that, produced as it is by any animal at the mercy of language, en proie au langage, man's desire is the desire of the other." As Derrida reacts, and this is number 21 on your handout, this figure of prey symptomatically and recurrently characterizes animal obsession in Lacan at the very moment when he insists so strongly on dissociating the anthropological from the zoological. Man is an animal, but a speaking one, and he is less a beast of prey than a beast that is prey to language. There is no desire and thus no unconscious except for the human. So that's Derrida's critique. So Lacan's language may symptomatically fall prey to bestial figuration, but his theory of language nevertheless reaffirms the distinction and the hierarchy between human and animal. Again, you might think of Lacan as Plato. For Derrida, speech is what reintroduces the human back into Lacan's discourse. But does it matter what language he speaks? When Lacan speaks Greek, when he speaks tragic Greek, is he speaking in a human language? In designating Greek tragedy as a speech that comes from elsewhere, I want to argue that psychoanalysis remains receptive, if not to the animal, then at least to the posthuman. Far from investing in tragedy as a celebration of humanism, Freud and Lacan turned to ancient drama to explore the problem of human life. Rather than finding a prototype for liberal individualism, modernity and psychoanalysis in particular has uncovered in tragedy a model of radical intersubjectivity, an intersubjectivity which repeatedly calls the human subject into question. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud juxtaposes his discussion of the life and death instincts in elementary organisms to the tragic drama he sees enacted in his grandson's Fort Dar game. By placing Greek tragedy's confrontation with the death drive in dialogue with the instincts of a germ cell, Freud's text and psychoanalysis more generally offers a perfect model for understanding Antiquities' contribution to posthumanism.
Questions, really. So the first is I'm just trying to understand the notion of this social context to the life instinct. And I just wanted to understand, I mean, in that very first passage that from Freud, and I haven't read Beyond the Pleasure Principle recently enough to sort of, know the larger context for this, but what's so interesting about this is this idea of preservation and narcissism and individualism that's somehow turned inward, and yet at the same time, that's the instinct that brings about the meeting with other germ cells. And that almost, it seems like, of course, that's sexuality. Sexuality is both preservative and outward turning, but I wondered if you could take that little moment in that Freud passage, which seems to complicate the kind of life-death opposition, and tie it to some of the things you were saying about the social and the others, the social at the end. And then the second sort of related question is this notion, I love this idea of tragedy as this voice from elsewhere, and opening it up to the possibility that it might not be a humanist, but it might be a kind of non-human or a-human voice. And I wanted to understand whether for you, if what tragedy does, if tragedy itself, it might not matter the distinction, but whether tragedy constitutes another, the otherness itself, or whether what tragedy does is create, as it were, a kind of home or a space or a temple for, whatever, a kind of machine for the non-human. And I'm thinking at the end of the Oedipus at Colonus, the way in which that voice is not a voice that calls Oedipus, or that the vision that Oedipus sees, or his encounter with the gods is mediated by Theseus being seen looking away, so that there's all of these stages of mediation that are part of tragedy's constitution of a unrepresentable encounter. So I wondered if there was a distinction that was worthwhile to you between tragedy itself as that othering voice, or whether as a kind of mode, a mechanism, a space into that.
Great, thanks so much. Both of those questions are perfect, and I agree with you completely on both of them. I think what you bring out about that first passage is brilliant, and I think that's exactly where the connection to Lacan is. In a sense, I felt like I needed to go out of the Freud to the Lacan to start thinking about what that relation to collectivity has to do with death. And here, as you're saying, it's not with death, it's actually in the life instinct. And so I think that's very, that's very interesting in terms of then thinking about tragedy. I suppose in a sense the two questions are linked in a way, because if I'm saying the way in which to recuperate tragedy is the voice of the non-human or the posthuman or so on, is to associate it with the death instinct via Lacan, but I don't really want to do that. And I think you're right to say that what I'm saying, I'm not quite saying that tragedy is the voice from elsewhere. I think your idea of it being a kind of mechanism for thinking through that question is precisely what I'm trying to do. But I think it's got to do with something to do with that question that we were looking at when the turn to Honig and thinking about the problem with a kind of mortalist humanism, which I think, although I say Lacan doesn't fully fall into, I think there's if we're going to say the reason why tragedy is the voice of the posthuman is because of this relationship to the death instinct and that its collectivity is entirely tied into the question of the death instinct. I think I don't really want to go there. I think that the dangers that Honig brings up in that kind of association are such that it makes it not a very profitable area. So if we can go back to Freud and think about that sort of simultaneous question of collectivity and individualism being right there in that discussion of the life instinct, I think there's more that can be done there in terms of trying to rethink what tragedy is about, that it's a mechanism of the life and the death instincts. It's not just associated with the death instinct.
But it's not just in erotics.
Yeah.
There's a broader notion of the social being collective that one might not suspect from Freud, but then there's a space where it's not just the other death instinct as in erotics.
Absolutely.
Erotics of a collectivity that's not
Sure, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that's where the connection to natality is kind of interesting, because that's moving the erotics into a different conception of life, which is not just reducible to that kind of form of erotics. So thank you, that's great. But I have to think a little bit more about it, and a little bit more about what I want to do with that, with the Freud, and whether to bringing him back in, I think, would be great in terms of not just moving beyond it. And
you chose, I think, probably correctly, not to talk about Lacan's Antigone. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could somehow inscribe that into what you've been talking about, and whether that in some ways responds her inability to compromise, and that being an ethics of desire, mm-hmm. whether that allows for that conjunction that you've just been discussing about.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I mean, if I'm saying that Lacan turns the sort of the Freudian Oedipus from an Oedipus of Eros to an Oedipus of Thanatos, what do we make of the Lacan who's of the Antigone, who's the embodiment of desire? And the embodiment of an eros. And I think it's really, despite that, it's the sort of absolute, as you say, the sort of negativity of desire that you get in. I mean, it's dual, right? It's not ceding on one's desire, and that has an extraordinary force. But there's a certain sense of the refusal, the strongness of the refusal, and the extent to which Lacan's Antigone is such an individualist, the difficulty of trying to relate that back. I mean, although she again, I mean, he obviously does similar things in terms of thinking about the entry into the symbolic, and so you have similar questions of collectivity coming in through there. But I think the way in which Lacan conceives of Antigone as being completely within a world of her own, completely undialectalizable with Creon, the total focus on her, I think makes his Antigone vulnerable to the worry about questions of collectivity and so forth that I was bringing up at the end. So I prefer his Oedipus. actually, to his, to his Antigone as a model for thinking through some of these questions. But I think they are connected, and certainly, as you say, if one thinks precisely about that difference between Eros and Thanatos, why do they get differently parceled out in those different plays? And I think that's a very interesting question. But I have to think a little bit more about what I want to do. As you say, I mean, there are obvious, very, very obvious similarities, but I think there are also differences, and it's interesting. The different moves that he makes vis-a-vis Freud in both those texts are very telling. So, but thank you.